We borrowed 21 billion in June, rounding up. That's 7 billion more than at the same time last year. So obviously things are trending in the wrong direction in Argentina, because in a relatively short space of time, he's been able to engineer, I think, a 30% real terms decrease in public spending. I think he's scrapped 50% of the central government departments, laid off tens of thousands of public employees. They've made huge savings on pensions by holding them down in nominal terms.
40% saying they have a positive view of communism, a quarter or so saying they have a positive view of fascism.
Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Head of Media and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am delighted to be joined by Tom Clougherty, the IEA's Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, the IEA's Editorial Director. Today we're going to be discussing the current fiscal situation, the leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, saying that Javier Milei is the template, and new polling which suggests that young people are sympathetic to fascism and communism. Tom, would you like to talk about the fiscal situation? So we've seen the new borrowing figures, which are pretty stark. Tell us what they say.
Yeah, so basically we borrowed 21 billion in June, rounding up. That's 7 billion more than at the same time last year. So obviously things are trending in the wrong direction on the public finances. Debt interest was about £16.5 billion in June. I think we get too used to just tossing around billions, but bear in mind, these are gigantic numbers. And so it really is quite extraordinary. I think that the kind of financial commentators who look at this stuff are saying this means Rachel Reeves is probably 15 to 25 billion off meeting her already rather relaxed fiscal rule at budget time this autumn. So again, we keep saying it, and I suppose we'll probably have to keep on saying it unless there's some dramatic upturn in the economic news. It does look like, because the government is in this situation and because they can't drive through seemingly any public spending restraint whatsoever, it does look like we're going to be talking about tax increases as that budget looms in the autumn. So obviously there's been a lot of chatter about the wealth tax. I know Kristian has read something new on that and wants to talk about it, so I won't go there. But, I don't actually think they're going to do the wealth tax for certain very good reasons. But it's interesting, I think, to speculate a little bit about what they'll do if they don't do a wealth tax. So maybe we'll let Kristian talk about the research out from Dan Neidle this week, and then I can...
Well, yes, it's one of those things where I thought there was nothing new to say. Everything that can be said about the wealth tax, we've probably said most of it on this podcast. But it turns out this new paper by Dan Neidle and I think some co-authors, I assumed so far that if we had a wealth tax here, it would be more or less just a British version of what currently happens in Norway, Switzerland, Spain, the remaining OECD countries that still have wealth taxes. He shows that it would probably be quite a lot worse than what they do. Because the way other systems get around the valuation problem is, it's a bit of a cop-out. They just say, well, some things are hard to value, so we just don't bother. Those are all exempt from wealth taxes. So in Spain, pretty much every non-listed company isn't really counted towards your personal wealth. And, in that way, you get rid of most of the problem. It causes some inefficiencies because it means that people are not, somebody, say a company owner, they're thinking about going public, turning their company into a listed one. Under those conditions, they probably won't do it. It causes distortions in that way. But it is relatively easy to avoid, causes therefore some distortions, but it's not massively economically damaging. It doesn't cause capital flight, and it doesn't decrease the savings and investment rate drastically. Dan Neidle shows in a paper that all the proposals that we have suggest a much more uncompromising version of a wealth tax. So one where there are basically no exemptions. It could well be that they're bringing them in last minute because they're not really thinking about valuation problems right now. And once they come up, that then they will say, oh wait, there's a problem here. But so far, the idea is that this does apply to pretty much across the board, any form of net wealth. And then you run into all sorts of problems. Then you really need a massive valuation bureaucracy, which we would have to start from scratch. There is nothing like that right now. We would have to set that up, and that will be either a new department within HMRC or a new public sector organization or whichever way they do it. And then the capital flight problems they really do become binding then. And they would be more binding here than in the places that currently have a wealth tax. So they have this link where they show, the argument is, and I think we've said this here as well, that if we look at the top percentile or so of the income distribution, where Britain differs from most of the rest of the OECD is that here a lot of the super wealthy are basically foreign born. They have a weaker attachment to the country, that they have, say, even now, they have residences in multiple countries. And Neidle contrasts this to the Norwegian situation. So there's a link to the rich list of Norway, and you can go through the list of the names of the richest people. Now, I haven't looked up their biographies, but it's just the names are so stereotypically Norwegian. So basically everyone on that list is clearly Norwegian. They were born there, they built their wealth there. They clearly have some rootedness in the country. And that is not the situation here, where Neidle and his co-authors, they also make clear that it's not so much, when we talk about somebody moving, relocating, it sounds like they're upping their sticks and burn their bridges. That's not necessarily how it works. It's more that these are people who already have multiple residences. They divide their year. They spend some time in London, some time in New York, or sometime in Zurich, wherever. And well, it's more about they would just balance that a little bit. So cut back a bit on their UK time over the course of a year and shift that to some other place. Their daily life over the course of a year probably wouldn't change that much. They just do it in such a way that they are no longer residents here. They stay just below the residence limit, and that's quite easy to do. They can still come here, of course, for visits. The short summary: this is a much worse version of the wealth tax. So all the versions that have been discussed so far. If we had a wealth tax, it would probably be more damaging here than elsewhere, both because of the demographic situation, because of the nature of the super rich here compared to other places, and because of the nature of the wealth tax that we're getting here. And I wouldn't rule it out. It could well be that, out of panic, we now have a situation where the government is clearly on the back foot. They U-turn over everything. They're no longer in control of the narrative, the policy narrative. That's long gone. It could well be that they feel that's purely out of desperation. Coming under pressure, maybe from this new Corbyn Sultana party, your party. That's definitely not called your party. Whatever, it could be that out of a panic reaction, they will say, "Oh yes, we will do this." But the problem then becomes, say, if we introduce the wealth tax now, you would definitely have an IFS paper in 5 years, 10 years time saying, well, it didn't do much good. Everything that we've said here would turn out to be correct. It's just that by then, the activists who currently push for wealth taxes, they will have moved on. There will be some new trendy cause in town, and they will not be wealth tax campaigners their whole lives. In 2 years' time, there will be something else, and something else will be the fashionable cause. But once you have the policy, you won't get rid of it so easily.
And you won't necessarily win back those people who have left and invested their money and taken their businesses elsewhere as well. So, I mean, obviously, we've talked about the wealth tax several times on this podcast. We've both written a bit about it and everything. And so I think we've made many of these arguments. There's a couple of things that Dan Neidle, in his piece, which is on the website Tax Policy Associates, and I highly recommend that people go and read that if they're interested in this topic. It's a great piece of work. There's a couple of things that he stresses that I'm not sure that I've kind of put front and center in my commentary yet, and worth bringing up here. So, obviously we've talked about how they can create extremely high marginal tax rates on the return on investment, how they're likely to drive people overseas, and because they're targeted at a very mobile population, that effect is probably going to be accentuated in the British context. But one of the things Dan points out is that people, if they're going to be subject to this tax, they are going to need the free cash to pay it. So there's a strong incentive then for businesses to pay out higher levels of dividends to reinvest less than they would have done otherwise. Investments in the UK become relatively less attractive because of the wealth tax than taxes in other countries that maybe have similar prospects. So again, you get less foreign direct investment, less capital for business. You also have a very particular effect for people who are, say, entrepreneurs. Say you've got a tech startup and it's valued at a certain amount of money and you need to pay your wealth tax that year. But of course, these people, they may have enormous future earning or capital gains potential. Often they're not flush with cash at the moment. They might be living off a kind of stream of VC income or something. So, what do? Well, if they're subject to the wealth tax, and if you don't have like privately held companies exempted, as you do I think you did in France when they had a wealth tax, and as you do in Spain at the moment, they're going to have to continually dilute their stake in the company. They're going to have to sell off chunks of their company at a time to pay a tax. Now, that kind of ruins the whole startup model, but it also makes this a deeply unattractive place to start a business in the first place. And, it will probably accentuate that trend we already have of people getting the heck out of Britain as soon as they get any interest from an American company that wants to buy them up. So I think effectively what you're talking about with the wealth tax is not just what we've seen with like the non-dom levy, which is some capital flight and some rich people moving and taking their spending and their earning and everything else with them. It's actually a much more fundamental decapitalization of Britain and Britain's business scene. And this is, just underlines why I think this would be such a disaster, and why I still have, you can tell me I'm naive in 6 months' time, some faith that the government won't go near this. But you have to think of all these wider political dynamics and the possibility that they will just be pushed to the left. So all of this stuff, this is bad news. I don't think they're going to do it. There was an interesting piece, though, in the Telegraph today by the wonderfully named Adam Smith. So he was an advisor to Jeremy Hunt when Jeremy Hunt was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So I think he probably knows a little bit about what the Treasury suggests when you have a Chancellor who needs to raise revenue and close a fiscal gap. So it's kind of interesting the things that he was suggesting. He thinks that the Treasury will be pushing the idea of higher taxes on immovable property. So residential taxes effectively, maybe moving towards a proportional property tax. Now, I actually don't think that would be a bad idea. Stamp duty, it's a bizarre tax based on property values from 1991. Things have changed a bit in the intervening period. It isn't a fair tax. It isn't a rational tax. You could sort of get rid of it and roll it into something else. Stamp duty is a complete disaster as well. Okay, so why don't we get rid of those taxes, replace them with a straightforward tax which is just based on a property's rental value or its capital value? The Fairer Share campaign, I think they're called, has talked about this a lot. They've come up with a decent model for it. I think it would be a good idea. What I don't think, though, is that it's actually going to raise any more money, or it's not going to raise any more money than the current system without a gigantic political backlash.
Would it be less damaging to behaviour?
It would be far less damaging to behaviour at a revenue neutral level. But if you're trying to actually fill a big fiscal gap with much heavier tax, this is the thing you have to bear in mind.
Could have growth consequences, or at least
housing. I think it would be pro-growth compared with the current tax system if it was revenue neutral. That's not to say it would necessarily be popular, because, as always, the people who win are unlikely to be as pleased and cheer for you as loudly as the people who are left worse off. Get angry and protest and everything else. But I think it's always important to bear in mind with the wealth tax debate when we're talking about property taxes, and I'm going to talk about capital gains tax in a minute, the same goes there. We actually raise a surprisingly high share of revenue as a percentage of GDP from these taxes already. And so we tax immovable property more heavily, I think, than any other OECD country as things stand. So I think expecting to get appreciably more revenue from that source is just not realistic. So for me, that's an avenue. It might be a worthwhile reform, but it's not something that's going to deal with the immediate fiscal problem. Higher capital gains taxes, higher dividend taxes. Again, our rates are relatively high by international standards already. Do we start putting capital gains on primary residences, which are exempt at the moment? Again, you could, and some economists argue for it, but I think, frankly, if you start... one of the big problems with capital gains tax is you get a lock-in effect. People hold the asset for much longer than they would otherwise because they don't want to realise the gain and therefore have to pay tax on it. I think if you apply that to housing, you'll go, especially if you still have stamp duty and everything else, you're making a bad problem much worse. You're gumming up a dysfunctional property market even more. I think all of these taxes need complete overhauls. I think you can make them much more pro-growth in a revenue neutral way. But if you're relying on them to raise a lot more revenue, frankly, you're barking up the wrong tree, and that will have negative consequences if you go that way. So look, what else might they do? I think extending national insurance to investment income in various forms is a possibility. don't favour that, needless to say. Equally, I think maybe things like tightening up on pension tax relief, on rules around ISAs and these kind of things, because the government has this pledge not to tax working people. And although the definition of working people seems to be getting narrower and narrower and narrower over time, if they stick to the fact that they're not going to cut spending, so therefore they need to raise taxes, and they're not going to do it through income tax, employee national insurance contributions or VAT, then you start looking at all of these other different things. I mean, I suppose my point, and I apologise if this has been a bit of a rambling answer to a question, is that there are no easy answers here. They've ruled out the easy answers effectively, so they're left with things which have a lot of unpleasant trade-offs alongside them and which I just don't think are going to realistically generate much additional revenue.
It's interesting you mentioned the application of national insurance to investment income. There was a suggestion of applying national insurance to the state pension. Yeah. And there are a couple of different, obviously,
or retirement income in general,
from private pensions. So it's interesting. I don't think that would necessarily raise very much money at all. But on the spending side, what do you think actually can be done? And we've spoken about this a lot, of course, and I know, Kristian, you've written a lot about it. But in the long term, what can actually meaningfully be cut? Because what's currently being discussed and been floated are basically, jobs in the bucket in comparison to what the entire system really looks like. Public spending as a proportion of GDP is about to get to 50%. I looked at one of the IFS's papers recently. I think it's from end of last year. And it is basically the NHS and pensions. And then everything else is very, very small in comparison to it. So what can actually be done sustainably in the long term to reduce public spending?
Well, one of them is the issue that got you into trouble the other day, which is, of course, the triple lock. Yes, and another one of those greatest hits that we keep returning to. But the triple lock shouldn't exist. And I think it was born out of a pure panic reaction where they had this formula before, I think in Gordon Brown's days, where on one occasion, the increase in the state pension was some ridiculous amount, and therefore that caused headlines where journalists were making fun of the government, and it was a bit of an embarrassment for them. And therefore they didn't want a repetition of that and said, okay, we will bring in this formula where it will basically always go up by a substantial amount so that you won't get headlines saying pensioners getting an extra 10p or so. Mm-hmm. And where they should simply have said, well, look, this isn't me sitting there deciding pensioners should get 10p. It's a formula. And if the thing that the formula is attached to doesn't go up very much, then pensions won't go up very much. And this is not a politician deciding this. This is automated. And that's the point of it. And they should have stuck with that. So you can absolutely go back to an earlier system where you have some increase, but you just make up your mind. What do you attach it to? You raise it in line with something and not with the highest of multiple things. Because there the problem becomes also that, and I think this was the latest OBR forecast where they said, it isn't so much about what's the rate of wage growth, what's the rate of inflation. It's more about volatility in these variables. That if you have a system where, say, inflation is all over the place, or wage growth, where there's a lot of oscillation from year to year, under those circumstances, that's when the state pension goes up more, because the highest rate is the one that's picked, and that is locked in from then. So if you have, say, if whatever that variable is then collapses and is very low next year, then you're not getting a weighted average. So even that would be an improvement to just have, rather than whatever the value is in one given year, have a rolling average. Yes, or
just being pegged to CPI.
So, I mean, it used to be pegged to earnings, and then it was pegged to CPI, and then we got the triple lock. And I mean, look, I think the triple lock should go. Personally, I would favour relinking it to CPI because that's probably going to be the least generous option. And I think that we then want a kind of generational effort to encourage people to save more privately. And look, I'm not a politician. I don't have to get elected, so I can say these things much more easily. I mean, I think there is a case if you have to, for some reason, maintain something called the triple lock. As Kristian suggests, don't just make it the highest of any of these figures in a given year. Make it the highest of a rolling average of each of those figures, say, over the last 10 years. So that's more generous than linking it to any one thing. That could, I suppose, guard against, what we had in the 2010s of inflation being very low for a long period of time, or indeed wage growth being pretty low as well. So maybe that would be more generous to pensions, but it would still save significant sums of money compared with the kind of raw, crude version of a triple lock that we have at the moment. If I may say so, though, Reem, and I don't want to preempt you, I think you've brought us on to our second topic inadvertently, which was Kemi Badenoch saying in an interview that was in the Financial Times this week that Milei is, what was the word? Milei is the template. Yeah. Now, she was asked a question about Javier Milei, and she responded with those words. So I'm not sure that she went into the interview saying, I want the headline to be, a future Conservative government would be based on Javier Milei's policies and everything. And I'm not sure she would even be necessarily endorsing these specific things that Milei was doing. But effectively, she also said in the same interview, we need to get to grips with the size of the state. No more top slicing. We need to look at what the state does and how it does it. And I think that, in a sense, that is the more fundamental answer to your question, that the 2010s model of austerity, of just trying to squeeze everything, keep doing all the same stuff, but on fewer resources, we kind of ran out of road. We got the backlash, the political backlash, and then you also got the inevitable kind of swinging of the pendulum where all of that restraint was abandoned. It turns out at precisely the wrong moment, because then we went straight into the pandemic and spending went through the roof as a consequence.
What's that point with regard to austerity? I mean, I think that even just the term austerity, I think, is particularly misleading because public spending actually in totality didn't really reduce. What we saw was reductions in day-to-day spending. And as you said, I mean, it wasn't the fundamental question of what does the state do and should the state be doing all of these things, but instead it was let's just let the state continue to do these things, but do it with much less money and much more constrained budgets. And so you did actually get, less money for your public services, so to speak, because it meant that, from the day-to-day level, there wasn't the same amount of money.
But let's look at Milei in Argentina, because in a relatively short space of time, he's been able to engineer, I think, a 30% real terms decrease in public spending. Now, they also, despite inflation having come down significantly in Argentina, they are in a sense benefiting from inflation being very high, because if you just keep things, the
value goes down.
held in nominal terms, the real terms value goes down. So that's a sort of not something you'd want to see anywhere, and particularly not in Britain since we're here. Maybe that makes his life a little bit easier in this one narrow respect. But I suppose it does show that if you're prepared to think about things very fundamentally, and, I think he's scrapped 50% of the central government departments, laid off tens of thousands of public employees. They've made huge savings on pensions by holding them down in nominal terms when inflation has been running ahead. And probably the public sector's workers have had an effect there, slashing or eliminating subsidies. And okay, we're not as subsidy hungry a country as Argentina has been, but, look at the energy subsidies we've shelled out in recent years. To consumers of energy, then think about all of the subsidies we're shelling out to the providers of energy at the same time, especially in the renewables field. Think about agricultural subsidies and all sorts of other things, enormous amounts of waste in government spending. At the same time, I mean, that's one of the ironies. There is enormous waste, and they're spending on things that money simply shouldn't be spent on. And yet there are also bits of the public sector, often they're the core functions of the state, which do feel really threadbare. But listen, if any politician is going to say Javier Milei should be the model, I think that's something to be applauded. Obviously, yes, the circumstances in Argentina are kind of specific and unique. But I suppose what makes Milei stand out from other politicians, A, is that he's a true radical, but B, he is rooted in a very particular philosophy. He is coming at things from a classical liberal or a libertarian perspective, and he is trying to put that into effect in policy. This is not just your standard political crisis management. It comes from a worldview, and he's sort of fundamentally trying to reshape the Argentinian state. And I think when you talk about what is our budget deficit at the moment, like 5.5% of GDP, that's bad. It's storing up problems for the future. It's not catastrophic. It's not like what you got in Argentina. But when you look at the effect that an aging population is going to have in the UK on the way that deficit is going to grow and grow and grow on the current policy settings, Well, hopefully we can change long before we get there. I mean, I think that's my point in a way. But also, yes, we shouldn't just think it couldn't happen here. It would be much nicer if we can do the radical thinking early and we can avoid the kind of shock therapy that has been necessitated in that case. And then maybe also we can avoid these kind of horrendous political fallouts that come when you hit kind of crisis point and when people think things are just absolutely fundamentally broken.
A lot of this is basically political economy, isn't it? I mean, the conversation around what Kemi Badenoch said around Javier Milei, I think, is a really interesting one. And I hope that it is rooted in a genuine sort of desire and interest in sort of small state ideas. I will say, I mean, I think I agree with you in your analysis of Milei and Argentina and the fact that it was basically sort of rock bottom and the UK hasn't quite hit that yet. But politically, the question is if we need to hit rock bottom in order for us to actually get to political reform in this way. I don't think that we do, and I hope that we don't get to that stage. I'd also say on certain things like the pension system, right? I mean, the pension system is basically like the new NHS. Like you cannot criticize the pension system. And I think a lot of it is partly because of who those voters are, right? It's a political economy problem. Older voters are way more likely to vote. Older people are way more likely to vote and therefore way more likely to hurt the government or hurt a political party if they make a particular economic decision. Yeah. There was some interesting stuff online where they were saying, you know, what was the worst thing that this Labour government has done? It's always winter fuel payment. So there was literally almost, you know, a drop in the bucket, and of course it ended up getting U-turned anyway, and it was effective complete U-turn. But despite that.
And that's one of the differences, though, with Argentina, that Milei, obviously in absolute terms, his situation far worse. But that's why he also had some low-hanging fruits. He could do things like abolishing rent controls at a stroke and abolishing capital controls and things like that, where this isn't even super radical libertarianism. This is just the first chapter of the Econ 101 textbook.
This is mainstream, guys.
Yes, and you can apply things like that, and you can see some short-term effects. And yes, he is upsetting some people. There's always some short-term losers, but I'm guessing some tenants who were on some of these contracts where their rent couldn't really be raised, or where it couldn't be made inflation-proof and things like that. But those were not specifically the people who got him into office in the first place. The difficulty here, that especially a government of the political right would have, is that, if you wanted to do things on the fiscal side, who would be your main opponents? It's the boomer vote, NHS pensions. What if you wanted to do things on the supply side? Who would be your main opponents? Again, it's the boomer vote. Yeah. So it would be much more like a version of Milei, who somehow got elected only by his worst enemies, then without them realizing, we are actually the turkeys who just voted for Christmas, and then Father Christmas comes in and says, "I'm surprised."
So, I mean, the Labour Party have less of that problem, right? Because they older voters that tend to vote for them, and yet the winter fuel payments reduction or restriction eligibility wasn't able to happen either.
I mean, it's true, yes, that they rely less on older votes than other parties do, but at the same time, I mean, we are an aging population. I think I said it last week, but according to my former colleague Carl Williams at the Centre for Policy Studies, we have about 50% or just over 50% of parliamentary constituencies are majority kind of over 50 or over 55, and that's going to get more pronounced over time.
So the average age at the election last year, I think, was over the age of 55.
Was it? Okay, so there you go. I think just one thing I wanted to add to this discussion is I've kind of been thinking about this concept, which I think goes back to the mid-1970s, of government overload recently. And this really stemmed out of a conversation I was having with some fairly politically switched on friends who were, really, really disappointed with the Labour government. They expected more and they couldn't believe how badly it was going. And my response, and not like trying to be smug about it or anything, was, do you remember all of the previous governments? Because to me, yes, there's a lot to criticise, and I do a lot of criticising. But if I think back over the course of my, policy career, there have only been maybe a couple of temporary outbreaks of governing competence in this country. Like I think Blair in his second term, where he kind of got a bit of reformist zeal for a little while. I was like, well, actually, there's some good stuff going on here. Don't agree with all of it, obviously, but there's some stuff that we can cheer about. And then I think the coalition government had its moments as well, where at least you were being sort of rationally governed, and some good reforms on education and on welfare, for example, were proceeding, and they were managing some fiscal consolidation. For the most part, though, my experience of British government, and honestly, I think the experience of anyone who's really paying attention should be, it's just crap almost all of the time. Yeah. And, it's easy to say, well, okay, maybe they're bad people with bad ideas. I'm not sure that that's always true. And, yes, there are the very classic kind of free market points. We can be Hayekians and say, well, they lack the information they need to do the things they want to do. It's an impossible task they're setting themselves. There's something in that. You can be public choice theorists about it and say they have the wrong incentives, the institutional structures are wrong. It will almost inevitably lead to suboptimal outcomes. And I suppose, this idea of government overload is it has some roots in both of those philosophies, but basically it's just the idea that the public demand far too much from government. Government takes on far too much responsibility. They actually aren't capable, and no government would be capable of discharging these responsibilities effectively. And I think maybe you see this not just in Britain, but around the Western world. People are very disappointed with their governments. They expect more than they should. And the weird thing is governments repeatedly fail to deliver. But their response to that is not to say, look, we're overloaded with responsibilities. We're trying to do things which fundamentally we cannot do and no government could do. Their response is normally to take more power. Because I think, well, if we're going to be blamed for this, well, we might as well be as in control as we can be. So you centralize power, and then obviously you don't really have the expertise or the capacity to do this. So then you have to give it to groups of experts or quangos or regulators or what else. You end up with enormous government bloat, with enormous complexity, and you end up in a situation where you're held responsible for everything, but you don't feel in control of anything, and everyone is just getting angrier and angrier. And I kind of wonder whether this concept of government just being overloaded, it doesn't need to be necessarily an ideological point. Because you could say, I wouldn't say this obviously, I'd like to privatize a lot of things, but you could say, there's only so much that central government can do. A lot more has to be regionalized or localized, say, and maybe that would improve things. That, I guess, would be the argument of someone like Sam Friedman in his book, what was it called? Failed State? Yeah, among other arguments. I don't know. But I have this growing feeling that unless you're prepared, any government of any political stripe, to radically streamline Westminster, you are going to fail and people are going to be angry with you and you're going to get tossed out and the next people are going to come in and try the same thing.
I think this is really interesting. And I think it's also partly the kind of idea that when I would talk to people that generally speaking are supportive of big government or a larger government, even larger than the government we have now, they would say, no, the government is ineffective not because of what you say, Reem, which is that it's just far too big, but because it's the wrong type of people that are running the government.
Right.
And I think there's kind of is this sort of similar argument here. It's not that, this is the idea that actually it's the fact that the state as a whole is just doing far too much, that people expect far too much from the government. It's not because they're just the wrong kind of people. And at some point in the future, we're going to get the right type of people and everything's going to be okay. But it's actually...
these were supposed to be the right type of people. So we should have that experiment.
Yeah.
The good chap theory, the good vibes theory of governance has just been tested.
Yeah.
And on young people specifically, when it comes to the sort of idea around, communism and fascism, these kind of ideologies, from new polling from Onward has said that it's pretty popular amongst young people. Mm-hmm. They clearly want somebody in charge of the government and they clearly want some authoritarianism. Can you tell me a bit about the polling?
Well, yes, pretty grim. 40% saying they have a positive view of communism. A quarter or so saying they have a positive view of fascism. And that isn't just 18-year-olds. So this is up to the mid-30s, I think. Well, and then they have a cutoff point. There's still quite a lot of people in their late 30s or early 40s who still think that way. So you can no longer make this argument that, they'll grow out of it. They're going through a youthful phase. So,
they're in their 40s and they're still supportive of communism.
They still hold those ideas. It's sometimes tempting for people on our side of the argument when we see figures like that to dismiss it by saying, oh, well, this is just vibes and social media and they don't really mean it. They're not thinking this through. I think it's not so easy. So it's definitely the case that this revival of communism, socialism, that this is very vibes-based. But that doesn't mean that it's not real or that we can just dismiss it. Because the thing is, when to say that something is based on a vibe or on a political fashion, what that means is that people adopt these ideas as a way of signaling something about themselves, as a way of developing an identity, a persona. And when you see a belief as central to who you are, it's much harder actually to change your mind about this than if it's just something where you think, well, okay, based on the information I have now, this seems to be the most plausible thing. So the fact that it is very vibes and identity based actually makes it worse. It may well be superficial, but that doesn't mean that you can easily talk people out of it.
And I think this is sort of what happens when government is fundamentally broken and fundamentally failing for such a prolonged period of time. I mean, yes, maybe young people are always going to be drawn to more radical alternatives, to sort of utopian visions of a completely different future. I mean, after all, that is in a sense what Hayek was tapping into in his Intellectuals and Socialism essay when he said that liberalism needed to be more radical and more utopian to win over the intellectuals. But there's always that, but I also think it's just kind of the failed state of British government, which is driving people towards these extremes. We can't tell from this polling, by the way, what percentage of people are both communist sympathising and fascist sympathising. I suspect, unfortunately, that there are some who are in both camps at the same time. Look, I mean, I do worry about this enormously. Obviously, I don't encounter many young communists in my work. But I do increasingly, and I'm not going to say I encounter fascists, but I do encounter people who express, I find, very worryingly authoritarian views. And I'm not just talking about people who they think immigration should be brought under control. That's a reasonable position that lots of people can hold, or that people are upset about, like the degree of homelessness or petty crime you have on the streets. These are people who are just sliding into the kind of the darker reaches of the online right, and who are basically, I think, embracing ethno-nationalism. And this frankly is extremely disturbing, to find people expressing views that, even if they had held them 10 years ago, and I don't think they would have held them 10 years ago, even if they had, they would never have expressed them as openly as you were hearing them expressed.
So more normalised
in political discussions now. It's becoming normalised, and yeah, maybe a lot of this is to do with social media and everything, okay? And I don't want to be all pearl clutching and saying, we're sliding into fascism. I don't think we are. But I do think there is something deeply unhealthy and worrying festering away in debate in Britain, and in particular, I'm talking about younger people. This is not old reactionaries who've had the same views for years. These are people who you would never have expected to be coming into adulthood thinking the way they think. And look, I mean, that's something that everyone who believes in a free society has to worry about and has to actually try and take steps to combat. Because ultimately, I do think there is a responsibility on politicians and on governments to actually get to grips with the very real problems we have and deal with them in a responsible and rational way. Because let's face it, you can long for radical alternatives and you can long for everything to break down so you get some not so glorious revolution where the strong man comes in and deals with everything. But let's face it, we've seen this story play out so many times before in so many places around the world. And how often does it go well?
Yeah, never.
Yeah.
To what extent do we think this is an economic problem? I mean, it's interesting. A lot of the conversations that I've had about these particular, well, not this poll specifically, but the kind of feeling that this is probably happening, that there are more and more people that are supportive of really quite radical authoritarian ideologies. And a lot of the time it's discussions about culture and immigration, or indeed about the economic situation specifically. And I wonder if the adage around, when you're 18, if you're not a socialist, you've got no heart, and if you're 30, you've got no, and you're not a conservative, you have no brain. That kind of intergenerational divide and that kind of shift in your perspectives on things like capitalism. And when you become a capitalist, when you acquire capital, you suddenly start thinking the system isn't too bad after all. Maybe free exchange is all right. And you are less likely to be supportive of more radical left-wing ideologies or authoritarian ideologies. Do we think that the failure of the state has then resulted in the exacerbation of these kind of ideologies festering? And to your point, Kristian, that it isn't actually just the young people. People are in their 30s and 40s. That's still young. 40s.
Thanks, Reem. Well, like the teaser.
That are now continuously believing these quite radical, quite dangerous ideology.
Yeah, so I'm always a bit suspicious when some newish problem comes along and my solution to it is something that I want to do anyway. Then I do ask myself, is this a bit too good to be true? Am I being honest here with myself?
Well, we need to liberalize the planning.
Well, we absolutely need to liberalize the planning system. And in this case, I'm saying that because firstly, I think even if we have super cheap housing and a growing economy, there would still be economists in the country, and there might even be some fascists. Who knows? It's never going to be zero, but it's always about, does this stay at the fringes? Is this a bunch of activists, or does the more apolitical normie feel that they need to jump on that bandwagon? And when that happens, there you can say, well, there's probably an economic element of it, and also I keep going back to this, that before we had all these polls about far left ideology becoming popular, socialism being popular, this only started 10 years ago. The polling companies started to do this when we had this first wave of Corbyn mania, because this wasn't supposed to happen, and a lot of people were confused by it, thinking, well, these ideas have been defeated. Why is this man suddenly so popular? And that's when a series of polls by YouGov and others were being conducted, where they did ask, what is your view of this ideology, that ideology, when that came into focus. Even before all of this polling existed, I remember I was at some university, a panel discussion which was on the housing crisis and some of the spin-off problems from it, where I went into this thinking, well, this is going to be super easy. I'm up against three leftists. Surely they have no idea about the supply side. They will just talk about the footnotes, the irrelevant stuff, and I'll be the only one who can make a proper supply side case, which was technically true. It's just that I also noticed I did not cut through at all. So I might as well have given my entire talk in German. It was I clearly couldn't reach that audience. It made no sense to them. They just had the three leftists were all saying in different words, look, you can't afford a house. You can only afford, you're spending 80% of your salary on some shoebox or with mold on the walls, and this is capitalism. Capitalism is the problem. Capitalism is ruining your life, and they loved it. And I guess it made intuitive sense to them. And then comes along the guy who says, well, actually, if you look at house building rates over time, and here's the political economy of urban planning and so forth, well, it doesn't work so well. And that's when I realized, okay, this is no longer just the kind of issue where it's affecting a particular segment of the population. It's something that drives up poverty and is bad for that reason. But it is, it's leading to a political radicalization as well. And I thought that, I think in my case, it's not confirmation bias, because I thought that before we had this whole Corbyn mania explosion. So when it wasn't so obvious that there is a wider ideological trend around this, I already saw this happening. And in our survey that we did on this, for the paper Left Turn Ahead, I think 3 years ago, one of the questions said, do you agree that the housing crisis is caused by too little building, NIMBYs blocking everything, or is it the rich? Is it capitalism? Is it the capitalists holding the wealth and things like that? And it was quite clear which of these options was more popular. It is clearly people do blame capitalism for the problems they experience, and as long as that happens,
because it's easier to understand.
It is more intuitive, yes, clearly. Although it's also the supply side stuff that we talk about often on this podcast, that's also not complicated economics. That's what's slightly frustrating about
supply and demand. Like it's not, yeah.
And I think the issue is that in both cases here, so with the extreme left, people who are prone towards communism, they have a scapegoat for their problems, and it's capitalism or it's capitalists. And on the right, the people who are drawn to fascism, and I can't believe I'm saying that, they also have a scapegoat, and it's the foreigners. Yeah. Of whom there are clearly far too many, right? That's sort of the argument. And
have you seen my Twitter mention?
Well, I have, yeah. So I think in both cases there is deep dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and in many cases with kind of individual prospects. So, and listen, young people have not necessarily had the easiest start to working life. The economy has been stagnant. Wages have not been going up really for a long time. So fewer opportunities, which are less well remunerated. And then the things that you need for a good quality of life are just much more expensive than they need to be, or than they were, say, in your parents' generation or your grandparents' generation. So, you can understand people feeling like they have been dealt a bad hand, and being angry about it. And obviously it's our job to try and persuade them, just educate them about the real root of these problems and why we don't have enough economic growth and why we don't have enough houses and everything else. But it's much easier for a populist or a demagogue of whichever political persuasion to point to the scapegoat and say, this is the source of your problems. If we get rid of this, everything will be fine.
Yeah. But what I can't understand, and what I think we need to seek to understand, is why the scapegoat is either capitalism or immigrants, and it isn't the government. Like, why is the reason for a lot of these problems, which I think that there is ample evidence, like concrete, hardcore evidence that suggests that, take the housing crisis, the fact that it's impossible to build anything, the fact that the government actively restrict the housing supply, and that political problems are a part of that. And, a lot of these people are saying that it's capitalism's fault that we have such awful housing in this country, such a restricted housing supply. So the question is, why is it that people aren't seeing that it's the government that is actively restricting the supply of housing in this example? Or why is it that people don't see that it is the government's fault for a lot of these problems and not capitalism or the immigrants or whatever the scapegoat may be?
Well, one problem of our time is that even though classical liberalism has been in retreat for a while, that's not the perception. So you will still often read that we live in a hyper neoliberal era, that Britain is basically run from Tufton Street, and that we're the ones calling the shots. So people vastly overestimate how capitalist, how liberal the status quo is. And I think that's a difference to earlier times when, say, in the 70s, the people who would have worked here, our predecessors, would have been able to say, okay, the status quo is a bit rubbish, and it's a status quo that's very far away from what we want, what we're talking about. For us today, that isn't so easy, because when we go somewhere and talk about all the things that we're unhappy with and that we think should be organized in a very different way, there will be someone in the audience saying, but hang on, you guys are the status quo. You're in charge. And you broke it, you own it.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like what we need is a classical liberal, radical economic revolution. Would you agree? Great.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Sounds good.
I'll take one of those.
I'll take that too. Tom, Kristian, thank you very much for joining me today, and thank you to all of you for watching and listening. I encourage all of you to subscribe to insider.iea.org.uk to learn all about the latest stuff the IEA is up to.